We're going to talk today about raising money more efficiently from older donors in 2024. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are the big trends shaping their work and shaping their their donation patterns and their lives. And we'll use that to infer some of the better strategies here. So I'm very excited to be here with you all. A couple notes, mostly out of gratitude for you. One thing we like to do is make sure this is CFRE approved. So my colleague Phoebe, who will be chiming in later, helps get this session CFRE approved. So if you need the credits at the end of the session, please fill out a survey, and there's a question there about CFRE credits. So big shout out, Phoebe. Quick intros, quick agenda here. We'll do some intros. You can see the rest of the agenda. Big thing to know here is the slides and the recording will be sent around later today. So you can look for that, and we'll make sure to take care of you that way. Quick introductions before we get started. My name is Patrick, here pictured with a much larger beard. We get to work alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny. We are both the co-founders of a company called FreeWill. FreeWill also gets to work alongside almost 200 amazing, loving, diverse, thoughtful, smart folks. And together we have more than 4 centuries of combined fundraising experience and expertise. It's probably even higher now. It goes up year after year as we grow together. So really excited about that. Last thing before we get started, we're so happy, we're so thoughtful, we're so grateful and happy that you're here. And so what we like to do is send some of my favorite books to at least 20 folks. At the end of the session, again, in the survey, we'll drop a note in the chat. We'll drop a survey in the chat, and you can make a quick note in that survey if you'd like it. This book is by Carol Dweck. It's honestly it's a relatively ugly cover for how great this book is. Just going to name it. You can see at the bottom here, it's got a little shout out from Bill Gates about how good the book is. And it's a book about mindset and the new psychology of success. So Carol Dweck did a lot of the work on grit, as I'm sure you've heard about. Really excellent work in terms of how do you just be successful in your job, in your parenting, in your relationships, in your friendships, in your life, in your athletic endeavors, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll give this to you if you fill out the survey, and we'll select 20 folks. And we're just really happy to have you here. So big thank you. Catherine says she's reading this book now, and it's amazing. Teresa said it's an excellent read. Highly recommend it. So thanks everyone for that. All right, so let's talk about how your week is going. People are happy. Look at how much this has shot up over the last month. People are feeling generally very good. That's what summer does. Also, hopefully, we're seeing some general gradual increase in people feeling good about hitting their goals. So that's about as high as it's been all calendar year. In fact, it hasn't been this high since June of last year. You can see maybe summer really gets people pumped about their goals. So good to see there as well. All right, let us dive in now. Now we're getting to the crux of the session. We're going to talk about older donors. And these are some of my very favorite topics to cover, partly because there's so much fun to do the research, and partly because when we look at the generations, and we look at how the generations have been shaped, it really helps us understand why the world is the way it is. Not just fundraising, and not just what is the best email to send, although we will cover that, but really get a sense of like how did this all come to be, and why is America and a lot of the West, which is sort of shaped by the same demographic forces, together, why is it the way it is and what happened here? So we're going to go through that, and that's going to be really fun. But from a fundraising perspective, I mean, this is just enormously freaking important, right? And we asked you, when we talk about older donors, we're going to talk about folks that are roughly baby boomers and up, so sort of 60 and north. We said, what percentage of your donor base is over 65? And what you said, I mean, look at this numbers, right? So that's 16% said more than 3/4 of our donor base is over 65. But 39% said more than half to 3/4. So you look at this, and the majority of you have more than half of your donors being over 65. So we could spend every week on this exact topic, and it might be a great use of time, just to give you a sense of that. Right? Look at how small the 0 to 25 portion is, just 15%. So really interesting stuff there. But just to say, this one really, really matters. When we ask about what percentage of your fundraising revenue, not just what percentage of your donors, right? That was the last slide, was what percentage of the total number of donors. And you see here, wow, more than a quarter say 76 to 100%, and 42%, 41% say half to 3/4. So you're looking at about 66%, almost 2/3 of you get more than half of your revenue from these donors, and a full quarter get 3/4 of revenue from older donors. right? So really, really valuable. Now, when we talk about older donors, we're cutting this into two different groups, right? So there's two different generations. The first is called the silent generation. I'll talk about those first. Then I'll talk about baby boomers, which are the larger portion. So silent generation is born from 1928 to 1945. Those of you might have done some really quick math and realize these folks are between 79 years old and 80 and 96 years old in 2024, right? So, you know, on the older side here, this is really the oldest population, oldest generation of any significant population. There is the preceding generation to the silent generation, often called the greatest generation. There's only about 1.5 million of those folks left, right? So relatively few. It's why we're not focused on them to the same degree. Also referred to as matures or traditionalists, right? So, but really considered to be called the lucky few. In some cases, a relatively small population. A couple notable members of the silent generation include Dr. Martin Luther King, Audrey Hepburn was part of this generation, as was President Biden, right? One of the interesting things is that Joe Biden is the only president born in this generation. We've already had 4 baby boomer presidents: Clinton, Bush Jr., Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, all boomers. Baby boomers also born from 1946 to 64, between 60 and 78 years old in 2024. So the youngest boomers are 60. Another way to think about this, for those of you in the Gen X world, it's wild that next year the oldest Gen Xers will be 60 years old. I mean, this is grown pretty quick. Notable boomers, of course, Bill and Melinda Gates, Oprah Winfrey, Jeff Bezos, and obviously tons of other folks, including the presidents I just named. The 65 plus population grew by more than 1/3 during the past decade to about 52 million. So as a whole group, you know, there are just far more older Americans than there have ever been in any point in history. And this is true, by the way, if you're in Canada, if you're in Australia, if you're in Western Europe, this is true across the board. A quick quiz here, right, as we understand demographics. We talked about silence, we talked about generations. What is the ratio of 76-year-olds to 86-year-olds in the United States today? Just take a guess in the chat. We'll fire away some answers. Most of you will be wrong, some of you will be right. And then we will reveal the answers. Samantha says 2-to-1. Allison says 3-to-1. Graham says 4-to-1. Travis says 1-to-10, 5-to-1, 1-to-2, 2.5-to-1. Great. So the answer here is about 3-to-1. So a decent chunk of folks got it right? So for every 76-year-old, for every 86-year-old, excuse me, there are 3 76-year-olds. Now let's look at the ratio of 47-year-olds to 63-year-olds in the United States. What is the ratio here? Take another guess. 5-to-1, 3-to-1, 8-to-1, 1-to-4, 1-to-1, 3-to-1. Okay, a lot of good guesses here. And the answer is about 0.9-to-1. So we sort of think that there's always more younger people than older people because older people are more likely to pass away, which is true. And yet there's actually more 63-year-olds in America right now than 47-year-olds, which is sort of wild. It's just a really interesting dynamic here. Now, why would that be? Well, it turns out there's just a lot more folks born in some years compared to others, right? And we look at this is births per 1,000 women, which is how demographers like to talk about birth rates. So births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44, typically thought of as sort of the viable ages to give birth, obviously occasionally on either end of that. So look what happens here, right? You have relatively few people born between, say, 1930 and 1944. Why is that? Well, a couple bad things are happening that time. The Great Depression, the dawn of World War II. And World War II also means a lot of heterosexual couples are separated because young enlisted men are off to war. And then what happens in 1945? Well, the war ends, folks come home. This is in the United States, by the way. Good question, Yvonne. And then you see an enormous spike in 1946 because 9 months later, right, babies get born. That's how babies happen. But more in-depth version of that is for a different webinar. And you see an explosion of births for about 20 years, all the way through 1964, right? So we talk about baby boomers and people just name it as a generation, right? The sort of okay boomer, whatever thing. And we forget that it's actually a boom, Like it's a huge increase in the amount of babies born compared to either before or after. And so you see a real shift here. And it's just important to understand how vastly larger boomers are compared to not just the preceding generation, but also the subsequent generation. Now, keep in mind, quite a few boomers have already passed away, and yet they're still larger than Gen X. I mean, it's really striking to see this. And so we'll see this. All right. But first, before we dive into this, before we dive into older donors, I want to share a framework that I've used in the past. Some of you may be familiar with, some of you won't. But it's a really important concept as we think about different ages. And in the future, we'll dive in more to Gen Xers and all their quirks. We'll talk about millennials and their hopes and needs. And we can get into Gen Z at some future session as well. But we want to think, when we think about generations, I don't want you to think about age, and I want you to think more about birth year and generation, right? And this is a difference between playing bridge and having knee problems, right? So what's the difference between playing bridge and having knee problems? Well, because when I was growing up, I would go to the great state of Rhode Island, to Cumberland, Rhode Island, small town, loosely called a suburb of Boston, near Woonsocket and near home of the former Pawtucket Red Sox. Great place. Anne says her family's from there. Meredith says best state ever. Rhode Island is a great state. It's not the point here, but it is a great state. And I would go to my grandparents' house, go to my mom's parents' house, and my grandmother and grandfather, who we called Mimi and Gramps because they were French Canadian, they would play bridge all the time. They'd have friends over all the time playing bridge. And I was like, okay, this is great. Like, maybe I should learn bridge, because when I'm an old person, I'll play bridge. Every old person I know plays bridge, and therefore this will be a thing. And what I realized is that playing bridge is not a function of being old. It's a function of being born in a certain period of time, right? So it's 1929 to say 1945. These folks were part of the silent generation. My grandmother was actually born on the day the stock market crashed in 1929. So she basically was born into a middle-class family that became immediately poor the moment she showed up on the planet. But what we realized is that this group had been playing bridge in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, into their early 80s, right? And it was just actually, bridge was a thing that people born at that time played, not that old people played, right? This is a big difference. And so one of the things that will make you laugh, but is also true, is that if you look at millennials, for instance, millennials have played a lot of video games, right? Both men and women, and folks that are 40 were playing video games at 20 and even 10. And so when you go to a nursing home in 30 or 40 years and you see millennials in the nursing home, as we will be, you'll see people playing, whatever super advanced version of Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty exists, right? That's actually what people will be playing in nursing homes, because it's a factor of birth year and not age. Ryan says he's a millennial and play cribbage. Ryan, I love cribbage, and next time we hang out, we should play some cribbage. It would be great. But just to understand, this is a birth year function, right? And the opposite of that, of course, is knee problems, right? Some of you may be unfortunate to have knee problems early, but for the most part, knee problems are highly correlated with age. And 80-year-olds have been having knee problems for millennia. And that is not the same as playing bridge. And so we really want to divide these two. And it allows us to really think about how we're addressing this group, not because we think that they're like folks who were old 20 or 30 years ago. Now, this is the most common cognitive mistake that I see fundraisers make. They grew up with their grandparents, and their grandparents acted a certain way, and then they assume that other folks who are older are going to act the way their grandparents did 20 or 30 years ago, and that's just false, right? Because they're confusing birth year with age. So I'm really glad to have that. All right, now that that's out of the way, we got to get a little shout out to Rhode Island. Shout out to Rhode Island, cribbage, all these things. Didn't mean to have those in there, but glad they're here. A couple more facts about this group, right? So these generations are much more religious than subsequent generations. 80% of baby boomers and 90% of silent generation identify with a religion, compared to only 35% of millennials. So that's a huge shift. They're less educated than younger generations. They are more educated than previous generations, right? So education levels in the United States has gone straight up over time. 25% of baby boomers and 10% of silent generations have bachelor's degrees or more, compared to 40% of millennials and about half of Gen Zers. I mean, really striking to go from 10% to 40% in 2 generations. This is a big shift. That 10% in the silent generation, part of that was that it wasn't widely accepted for women to go to college at the time. In fact, many top universities were not even co-ed until the 60s or 70s. So worth noting there. Other shared facts. Allison says, are you calling Gen X silent? No, silent is before boomers, older than boomers, then you have boomers, then you have Gen X, then you have millennials, and then you have Gen Z, and our youngest kids right now are called Gen Alpha, right? But there are no Gen Alpha adults, so we don't talk about them much from a fundraising perspective, right? Richard says, Columbia College went co-ed in 1983, which is not that long ago. And if you think it's that long ago, you're probably younger than the rest of us. So big deal. All right, so some other shared facts. There are more married with more children, and many are now grandparents. 67% of boomers and 83% of silents were married when they were 25 to 37, compared to only 46% of millennials, and presumably even fewer of Gen Z when they reached that age. 58% of boomers were women by 20 to 35, compared with only 48% of millennials. As someone noted in the chat, these are actually my parents. A photo of my parents getting married in the great town of Cumberland, Rhode Island, as we've already mentioned. When they were 22 and 21, they were children. And so it's sort of wild to see that. I meet 22-year-olds and I'm like, you have no business getting married now. So apparently they're still together 45 years later. So whatever they did worked out for them. Okay, couple of generations, right? These are generations that grew up in times of crisis, right? So if someone in the silent generation, you grew up during the Great Depression and World War II, this is not an easy childhood. You're often conformist, you're financially prudent. Another way to, people sort of financially prudent is the nicest way of saying super cheap, right? But they're really worried about totally running out of money, which is the thing that happened to a lot of folks in the Great Depression, right? Boomers, meanwhile, grew up during the civil rights movement, the cultural shifts of the 1950s and the 1960s, and by the way, a lot more abundance from things like the GI Bill. They fought in and they protested against the Vietnam War. And baby boomers are characterized as hardworking, self-assured, and independent, right? More independent than the silent generation. If you're a baby boomer, you also experienced an enormous shift in culture and technology. These were the first folks not only to see color TV, but also cable, internet, the first iPhone, right? You grew up with that whole, imagine growing up in a world without color television, and then moving into, obviously 3D and whatever, but smartphones and VR. Both of these generations are what we call digital immigrants, meaning they weren't born with computers, they weren't raised with computers, and they've grown into it. And they were born in a world before we started turning into a tech-first society. But this is a really important point. They are not technophobic the way that you might have seen some behavior of some folks in previous generations, especially boomers, right? They're not technophobic. And they've adapted throughout their lifetimes to embrace tech solutions in their everyday life. Other good news for us, they are the most charitable generation, right? Many of you saw, these are the folks that are driving the biggest dollars, right? Some of that's wealth and some of that's behavior. Together, they comprise 70% of all charitable giving. They prefer to give to well-known, respected organizations. 45% of boomers report researching an org before making a gift, and 85% are loyal to specific causes or organizations. So let's look at what's happening in 2024 that's really driving behavior by this group. Okay, as I mentioned, they are going online in huge numbers. 10 years ago, not that long, 2014, only 13% of Americans over 65 owned a smartphone, and yet now it's 76% in 2023, right? So in 9 years, we went from 13 to 76. Number is probably even higher in 2024. If you just straight line graph that, you're probably looking at north of 80%. And by the way, among your more affluent 65 plus, who tend to be your donors, this number is going to be close to 100%. They use smartphones to check email and social media. That's the obvious part. They're also doing things like telehealth, grocery shopping, buying mortgages online, doing finances online, all the stuff that you thought would never be online 10 years ago. All of that got sped up by the pandemic, and that's moving quite quickly. In terms of giving, 75% of online charitable revenue comes from desktop devices as opposed to mobile. And yet 36% of all number of donations were made on mobile. What does that mean? It means donations on mobile tend to be a little bit smaller, which is how you square that circle. A 2023 study by our friends at Giving USA showed that 61% of giving by boomers occurred online. And in 21, 34% of boomers reported donating via newer channels, GoFundMe, social media buttons, et cetera, right? So you're starting to see this more expansive view of how to fundraise, but online is taking front and center. Okay. Is this population growing or shrinking? It's growing by a huge margin, right? So the population over 65 is estimated to be 80 million by 2040. Most of your online traffic will be from this demographic. They tend to be the most generous. And when we think about this, right, it means that accessibility, website accessibility, especially for folks with visual impairment, is even more critical. And guess what? When we look at your websites, about 96% of homepages have accessibility failures. So we can talk more about that as well. But just to give you a sense, right, who has difficulty hearing? All right, we'll look at visual later. Hearing, you can see that this falls into the knee problems category, right? When you get over 65, 27% of people have some difficulty and 4% have can't hear at all. So we think about different ways to make our websites and other things more accessible for folks after that. All right, big trend number 2, right, beyond the sort of shift to online, their wealth has grown. So we're seeing a really strong continued explosion in boomer wealth and silent wealth. Silent generation is quite wealthy, and yet it still pales in comparison to the boomer generation. So about $19 trillion, capital T, in total assets for silent generation, $78 trillion hanging out with boomers. I mean, so much money. On top of this, these groups have also benefited much more recently from a strong performing stock market. We'll take a look at that in a second. But if you look at where we are right now, I mean, just look at this market as of the 23rd, which is 5 days ago, we made these slides. The S&P 500, which is an index fund, measures a lot of big portfolio of stocks, 5,300. Now, even in November of last year, it was at 4,200. It was at 4,000 before. And so this is an enormous growth. I mean, we're looking at more than 20% growth if you have all your wealth in the stock market, which not everyone does, right? Most people don't. But just to give you a sense, your wealth has grown by 20% in roughly a calendar year without working, right? Because you're getting all this savings. When we look at wealth by age, you can see in that dark purple, 55 to 69, and that baby blue, 70 and over, how much that's grown over the last 30 years. So what you're seeing here is, 35, 60, 45% of all wealth is held 55 to 69, and about almost 30% is held by folks 70 and older, right? So what is that combined? A little under 75% is held by folks over 55. And by the way, it's not a lot of folks 55 to 60. Why? Because that's a smaller part of the population, that Gen X. So you got to really see this. Anne says, and then there's real estate. We'll talk about real estate in a second. They're heavily invested in real estate, stocks, IRAs, donor advised funds. The total value of boomers' real estate wealth was 18 trillion, while silence was 4.7 trillion. So still pretty good. To give you a sense here, millennials hold about 5 trillion. So silent, small population hold about as much wealth as millennials. Boomers hold 18 trillion. Millennials, that number is going up pretty quickly. So that's going to go up every year. But you can get a sense here in terms of this number's a little bit out of date, but that a lot of the wealth growth has happened for older Americans compared to younger Americans, right? Especially when you factor in things like paying off student loans. So student loans are way in the rearview mirror for folks that are a little bit older. We look at generational home ownership rates, like who actually owns homes, because that's been a big driver of wealth. Boomers and silent generation as the top, Gen X and millennials. You can see millennials climbing quickly, right? Basically, no millennials held homes before 2000, and we're at almost 52% as of 2022. Imagine that number keeps going up, probably millennials at 58%. So you start to see a lot of that. Single-family home prices, right? So what's the difference between real estate wealth? Well, did you buy it in 1991 or did you buy it in 2020, right? And if you bought it in 1991, it's probably gone up 3 or 4 or 5x, especially, by the way, if you're in a major city or around a major city where you've seen just enormous spikes in housing prices. So really interesting stuff. They're invested well. In particular, there's a really interesting dynamic where starting with most folks in silent and most folks in boomers, retirement plans moved from pensions to IRAs. Now, a lot of that was sort of company preference. Pensions are when you get paid out a fixed amount every year, and IRAs is when you contribute a bunch every year, usually a fixed amount, and then you get out whatever you get out. There's approximately $14 trillion sitting in IRA accounts. According to Fidelity, they've experienced an 11% year-over-year increase in IRA accounts. This is as a lot of people retire and roll 401ks, which most of you all have, into IRAs. And it's led to an explosion in a type of giving called qualified charitable contributions, or I should say qualified charitable distributions, QCDs. For older Americans, QCDs will be one of the best ways to give, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. So how they give is changing. This is really interesting. Older generations have never had so much wealth compared to the rest of us, but they're asset rich and cash flow limited, right? They have less liquid cash to give. And so your solicitations are now competing with retirement savings, rising healthcare costs. And so high affinity donors are either the folks that might be tax savvy and looking for ways to give, or uneducated. But in both of these cases, there's a lot of opportunities. One silent generation donor we looked at with a partner organization, just to give you a sense of how this works. They were a higher ed institution. They received a $500 donation from someone in the silent generation. And within a year, they sent a follow-up gift of $1,000. Now, these are big donations for some of us, but if you're big time higher ed, institution, it's not a ton of money. But still, they said, okay, let's go dig in here. Let's figure out what's happening. And they had a personal visit in which the donor revealed they owned $10 million of IBM stock. And after they met with their CPA and attorney, they learned the benefits of stock giving. Because remember, this is incredibly appreciated. They probably bought this stock in the 80s or in the 70s even. The donor began giving stock instead of cash. And then as they got more sophisticated, they also decided to include the university in their estate plans. And this initial $500 gift then turned into a $4 million legacy gift, which is obviously going to do some amazing things at this institution. So this is one of the things that is happening with folks in the silent generation and older. Other things that are happening in 2017 and 2018 under the Trump administration is we saw some tax changes, which is now influencing the way they give. So there's something called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or the TCJA, which doubled the standard deduction for folks from 18 to 25. So it's going to end at the end of next year. But it also, by the way, it pushed down deductions for state and local taxes, which if you live in a place like New Jersey or New York or Rhode Island or Massachusetts or Connecticut, these can end up really pushing you into itemizing deductions territory. So now what's happening is most taxpayers in America get bigger tax breaks from taking standard deductions than they do from itemizing deductions like charitable contributions. The Legacy IRA Act was included in the omnibus spending bill by President Biden in 2023. This is a different tax form. And what this did is allow people to make a one-time gift in QCDs towards a life income gift from traditional IRAs. It also increases the amount annually that folks can give from QCDs beginning this calendar year, 2024. It also, by the way, shifted the time that people have to start taking money out of their IRA, but you can still start giving out of your IRA at the same age, which is a somewhat confusing but very important 70.5. And the last trend is we're really starting to see an explosion in estate planning, because where that $70 trillion they own, where it's going to go is being decided right now. So many older Americans are experiencing major life changes. They're moving homes, they're welcoming grandchildren. Some of you are baby boomers, some of you will welcome grandchildren this week, which was really exciting to see. But many of these folks still don't have an estate plan in place. And over 70, meaning more people with over 70 years old, with an established will or trust has actually been in the decline since the mid-2000s. So these transitions present a really valuable opportunity for folks in fundraising to help donors create or update their estate plans and nudge charitable giving in the form of what we call planned giving. So most of you know this, but planned giving is just what we call a gift in your will or in your trust, where you then leave a portion or a fixed amount to charity. This is a huge benefit to the donors who obviously need these plans, and obviously to your nonprofit. Just as a reminder, planned gifts are so much larger than any other type of gift you'll ever get, like in the case study we saw, where a $4 million gift was potentially transformative for some programs. So Make a Will Month this August is the perfect time to encourage estate planning, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. All right, some more information from you all. We asked you, how are you communicating with 65 plus donors? I won't read all of this, but I want to call out a couple of key trends here, right? A lot more phone calls, really interesting. Less mail, a little bit less email, fewer events, but phone calls were the only thing going up, which is really interesting. When we talk about gift, how do you market folks? Less cash gifts, fewer bequests, which is a big mistake, major gifts going up. QCDs are up 20% in terms of how we're marketing these. This is a really great move by the sector. 20% increase in QCD marketing, 17% increase in donor advised funds, a little bit less in stock, also a mistake. We have to be making sure we're talking about stock. Charitable gift annuities down and charitable trust up, crypto up, but very little, right? No one's really marketing crypto to 65 plus. So how do we secure more gifts, right? What do we do here in 2024? We're going to share a couple of strategies and we'll get to questions. The first thing is you got to make your website a welcoming place for older donors. And there's two different components here. You want to make sure it's accessible, particularly for those with vision issues and hearing issues, as we mentioned earlier. How do we do this? There's a bunch of best practices. We won't go into this right now. It's a little bit more complicated, but you can look up different ways to make your website accessible for people with low vision. There's things like screen readers, right? If we're having videos, we want to make sure there's closed captioning on the videos for folks who are hard of hearing. And then separately from making it a welcoming place, we need to make sure that we're acknowledging and promoting the best ways of giving for folks over 65 or older donors. And so that means including things like qualified charitable distributions, stocks, planned giving, and donor advised funds, not just cash. Now, there's this other weird quirk of the American economy, which is changing the way that people give when they give to the annual fund. Does anyone have a guess at one of the biggest shifts in the way people are giving their annual gifts? Feel free to make a guess in the chat. Take just 1 second to let people give. All right, we're seeing a lot of DAFs, a lot of PayPal. Still haven't seen, there we go. Ben Daniels, thank you, Ben, shared one of the things that is so prevalent in American society that we almost miss it. It is the rise of credit cards and the downfall of personal checks, right? And so what does that mean from a cash perspective? Well, what's one of the things that comes with credit cards? Monthly maximums. Really tough, right? It means that you just cap out your credit card. Even if you have a ton of money in your bank account, you can't make large gifts there. And many people don't have personal checkbooks handy. Now, some people still do, but there is a gentleman at the Fed in Philadelphia who suggested recently that he thinks personal checks are going to be obsolete by 2027. And so it's really shifting the way we give. And things like donor advised funds and giving stock allow for these much larger gifts that giving credit cards just actually functionally prohibit. And so that's a really interesting dynamic. Stephanie shares a fun fact, which I did not know, that New Zealand got rid of personal checks 3 years ago. Thank you, Stephanie. So when we think about these big gifts, right, a lot of them are coming from non-cash avenues, in part because cash giving has gotten worse, right? And so when we have these on our website, we see in our research that you can get 2 or 4 times as many gifts just by making this problem. Kaylee says she's a millennial, under 35, still uses personal checks. Kaylee, that's the lonely position, right? There are very few millennials using personal checks. Coming back to the vision impairment piece, just to put a finer point on it, you can see folks 75 and older, 7% have vision issues. This is when it really starts to kick in. 65 obviously kicks in a little bit more. And so this is a big deal. All right, strategy 2. One of the single best things you can do from a marketing perspective is a tiny brochure that you only have to make once. And yet this can be really life-changing for your organization. We call this the Permanent Giving Guide. We invented it last year and people love it. Permanent Giving Guide is a letter that explains the benefits of non-cash giving. You want to let people know, importantly, that the guide is useful for any of your giving, and not just giving to your organization, right? This is like a handbook that they're going to have in the future for any time they go think about giving. You can build it for free on an AI tool that we've built, but I want to talk more. And that tool, by the way, is at willy.freewill.com. It's totally free for folks. But here's a little bit more about this, right? In the guide, you ask donors to hold on to your letter. In really big letters, you just write this exact thing. Please keep this message. Please keep this letter or this guide for your future reference. And you can see right here what it looks like, right? So this is for Free Will partners, we've created some more fancy versions they can use, but you can use a text-only version for free at willy.freewill.com. And let me go back into what this is. What is this? This is a guide for the different ways for people to give. You can see on the front here, it has crypto, it has stocks and securities, it has donor advised funds, it has QCDs. And what we want is donors to hold on to this forever. Every time they go to give, they say, oh, let me go look at some of the ways that I could give that are going to be give me more tax savings so I can have more impact at less cost than if I just give cash right now. Oh, and by the way, even when I'm giving to my church or my synagogue or my college and not you, I'm going to be reminded that, oh, your organization is the one that is guiding me through this. And so every time I think about charitable giving, I think about your organization again. It's a huge win. And it's a pretty good avenue. Kim says they're a Canadian version. This is fabulous. Kim, what I would do is I would go use Willy to make one, and then you just make some small adoptions for Canada. So great question. Strategy 3, in all of your fundraising, if you include this one sentence, I guarantee you will get better results than you're currently getting. So I'm raising this because in our pre-webinar survey, you said, I struggle with changing their ways of giving. It's a challenge letting them know other options for giving. In every email, every direct mail piece you send, include this. You know, will you, whatever you're asking for money, will you chip in to whatever? Then you say, note, many people choose to give from their assets, stocks, gifts from their IRA, cryptocurrency, and grants from their donor advised funds to see even larger tax savings. Now, what are we doing here? We're doing two distinct things, and that are both extremely beneficial for your organization, just with this one sentence you're adding. The first thing we're doing is reminding people they can give in these asset-based ways, smarter ways to give, as we call it internally. And what we do here is we know that these gifts are better for donors, a lot better tax savings, and they end up being much larger for nonprofits. So that's a huge win on its own. The second piece here, and this is really important also, is that when we remind folks of their assets, they feel wealthier and they give more, even if they're just giving in cash or credit cards or stocks. Excuse me, cash or credit cards or checks, right? Because when we anchor people on their assets as opposed to their income or what's in their wallet, they end up giving more. So this sentence is going to increase the size of your cash gifts as well as get you more of these bigger gifts. It's one of the simplest ways. Danielle says, hey, are we still encouraging crypto donations? Danielle, crypto is actually at an all-time high this month. So definitely would suggest you consider continue to do so. But if not, you just take crypto out and can go from there. All right, strategy 4, going big on qualified charitable distributions or IRA charitable rollovers. This is one of the fastest growing ways to give. Why is it growing so fast? Partly you have more older donors, and partly it's the best way for older folks to give. So let's talk about this again. What are QCDs? These are a gift out of your IRA. They're commonly referred to as IRA charitable rollover gifts, although we prefer the term qualified charitable distributions because IRA rollovers mean something else entirely. Money is transferred directly from an IRA to a 501c3 charity like yours. Donors have to be at least 70 and a half is the hard part, but 70 and a half, and give up to $105,000 annually. A big driver behind QCDs are required minimum distributions, which the government says you have to take this much money out every year. Starting at 73, you have to do it no matter what, and you have to pay taxes on it. The only way you avoid paying taxes on money you might not even need is to give it to charity in the form of a QCD, and that can be to you. There is a ton of money in IRAs. Just as a reminder, Q4, right, the end of 2023, saw the highest amount ever after the end of 2021. right? 2021 was such a good year for stocks. You saw so much of it, but there's huge amounts of money in IRAs. Why do these work? Because money in an IRA is pre-tax, right? The same way that you put money into your 401k and don't pay taxes on it, it's the same thing with an IRA, and which means it will always be taxed, right? If I pass away and I'm below the estate tax threshold and my heirs get it, they are still paying taxes on it. Post-tax money is much more valuable to donors and should be conserved, and so we want folks to be able to give this. Thousands of boomers became eligible every day to give QCDs, and we're going to have more QCD donors than we did last year, and next year we'll have more than this year, and the following year we'll have more than next year, right? This is just going to be a virtuous cycle for years and years to come. But when we ask folks, how well do you think your donors understand QCDs? 11% says not at all, and then 24% say somewhat, 47% say moderately well, and a tiny sliver says very well. And so it's our job to educate folks because they'll really benefit from having these. QCDs are seeing enormous growth, and it can be very helpful because if we get that first one, then they become the annual gift, right? The recurring gift out of the QCDs. It meets RMDs, it helps them save on taxes, much better than cash for you because they result in a much larger gift from the same donors. The first dollar that an IRA owner withdraws counts towards their RMDs, so there's big benefit there. And if a donor is withdrawing funds, but they don't need the money to live on, they should make QCDs before withdrawing any funds for themselves. This will prevent them from adding to their taxable income, and it can be a really big benefit. Now, some of you might say, wow, I have a ton of donors who are over 70, but I don't know which, right? If you're at college, you probably know how old everybody is. And yet, if you're a land trust, you might just have a lot of donors. You might know that a lot of them are over 70, but you don't know exactly who. And so what might you do, right? So there's a great, here's an example of a better donate page. You can see here, right, it says help save Tibet, a little bit of language. Together we can shift the balance towards compassion and kindness, make a gift today. And you see here donor advised funds, IRA, stock, and crypto at the top. Really good reminder, again, this asset-based giving is going to drive your cash gifts up while also getting more of these gifts. Our friends at Second Harvest of Silicon Valley, you can see in the postscript at the bottom here, P.S. if you're 70 and a half and older, you can join other folks. It doesn't say you are 70 and a half and older, it just says if you are. And they'll include this in all of their messages because many of them will have half or more of their donors who are this age. As we think about this, right, donors can be confused. Your major gift officers can be confused about QCDs. So one thing you can do is you can use AI for help soliciting these gifts. Able to understand the key points and confidently walk your donors through the process is going to be really important. So QCDs are a perfect use case for Willy or other AI where you say, hey, give me some talking points on this as well. Okay, other big strategy, after end of year giving, what we find is the single most important time for fundraising in the whole year is August, which is super counterintuitive. And why is it August? It's because August has become the dominant month for pushing planned giving. And as I mentioned, planned gifts tend to be so much larger than anything else. So August is National Make-A-Will Month. And what we've seen is a huge number of organizations are now participating in this. 41,000 wills were made on free will last year. And it's a great opportunity for two reasons, right? It's an easy time to get on the calendar, but it drives a ton of giving. We saw almost $400 million raised last August, right? In the time you think everyone's just sitting on the beach and not thinking about this at all. Strategy 5, right? When you look at this, you can see this is sort of what an annual giving by month over the course of the year, and look at how much higher August is than everything else from a planned giving perspective. Really, really cool. As a reminder, just say one more time, bequests are the largest gift a donor will give in their entire lifetime. There's a bunch of IRS research that shows a typical bequest is 3 times the entirety that someone's given in their entire lifetime, which is crazy. Try pairing your outreach with a solution such as will-making kits, a list of local estate planning attorneys, and you can obviously use free will, either as a partner or unofficially as well. Okay, so we are running low on time, but I'm going to get to a couple of resources before we wrap up. The first is just as a reminder. Oh, thanks, Phoebe. My colleague Phoebe has just dropped our survey in the chat. It should be the bottom thing in the chat. So click, if you don't mind, just right now, click on that link and start filling it out. And I'll walk you through a couple of the cool things that are happening in the survey. One is we're going to send a copy of Mindset by our friend Carol Dweck, who is, again, fantastic, to 20 people as a gift. So please fill that out. Make a note in the survey. And of course, don't forget your address, which makes it a lot easier for us to actually send it to you. Second thing, tomorrow at noon, we are doing, my wonderful colleagues, Marshall and Eliana, are talking about what we call the free will featureship. If you are interested in growing your planned giving, I would strongly encourage you to attend this. And if you are a larger organization, either one with a national brand recognition or one that has a cause which is nationally recognized. So if you might be the Rainforest Action Coalition, you might say we only have 5,000 donors, but everyone likes the rainforest. This is a really good time for you to join. Same is true, by the way, if that's true of you, but it's about a given state or local area. So national featureships and local featureships are one of the coolest tools. This is basically how do you get in front of donors while they're making their estate plans on the #1 estate planning tool in the United States. So if you have half an hour, you can eat your lunch during it. Join us tomorrow. Join Eliana and Marshall. This is one of the most exciting tools that we think exists in the nonprofit space. So join that. On Thursday, many of you had a bunch of questions about Make-A-Will Month. We're going to dive in on what Make-A-Will Month is and strategies. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear from a series of different free will partners, which are just, awesome nonprofits around the country, about their experience with Make-A-Will Month in August. So join that on Thursday at noon. So it's a busy period, right? Tomorrow and Thursday, both at noon Eastern. But these are both going to be really great presentations. They're probably booked for 45 minutes. They'll probably be half an hour. Come hang out, nice and easy. No need to take notes, but really, really valuable information, we think. And so we're happy to put these on for you. We will drop a note. Oh, and then the next session, which I'm super excited about, is next Tuesday. So there's a lot going on here, and we'd love for you to join for as much as you can. But next Tuesday, we get to hang out with my dear friend, Dr. Russell James. And what Russell's going to talk about is how do you actually talk about planned giving internally, right? Many of you are fundraisers who are savvy, and this is going to be the future of our organization. It's how we're going to get transformative gifts. But our CFO or ED or our board just doesn't get it, right? They may not be fundraisers structurally. And many of you know Dr. James, either personally or by reputation. He is by far the smartest and best academic around modern fundraising, just the best. And anytime you can spend an hour with him, you should. And so we'd love to have you there as well. I'm just going to be there hanging out, emceeing a little bit, asking questions. All of this, by the way, is going to be in the survey. So please make a note there. But so excited to have Russell. He's the best. So that's what we got. Please follow the survey if you haven't already. Next webinar is June 4th. A couple of cool things happening tomorrow and Thursday. If you have any creative ideas, shoot me an email at patrick@freewill or find me on LinkedIn.